talk about borrowing costs, and some people would say the Fed can fix that. They could just cut rates, and they can cut rates pretty dramatically to offset the deficit, and it could actually de facto decrease the deficit dramatically, at least the borrowing costs that the U.S. will have to pay. How much do you understand different yield levels as being sustainable and completely unsustainable in the near term? Is there sort of a pivot point within the yield space where you say this is going to have alarm bells?
That is a great question, because the big question in all of this is, what is the timing of when markets would say we're not tolerating this? When might there be a treasury market that didn't go well? When might there be a situation where rates start to not respond? All I can say, we don't know the timing, of course. All we know is that the fiscal policies of this country are making monetary policy for our monetary policymakers much more challenging, because when they're trying to control a situation of inflation, we've got fiscal policymakers who are borrowing more, pushing inflation up more, and making the ramifications of changes in rates, if you want to control that inflation, even more threatening to our fiscal position.
Maya, this evening's debate is so interesting because it's basically two incumbents, and they're going to be asked about their record. Who is worse for the federal deficit, Trump or Biden?
Yeah, we have recently just looked at a record, what they did in terms of the borrowing that they approved while they were in office. All the numbers that we look at are over the coming 10 years. And admittedly, no president owns their economy or the fiscal situation, and COVID was a huge sort of unexpected thing that affected both presidents. But what we saw was that with COVID, President Trump added as much as $8.4 trillion to the debt over 10 years. Without COVID, it was about $4.8 trillion. That is an astronomical amount of money, particularly that so much of it was put in place when the economy was incredibly strong. So far, and President Biden's term is not over, and there's still a chance that he's going to add more to it, but he added $4.3 trillion without counting COVID, and his COVID wasn't bipartisan the way the President Trump's was. Those numbers would be $2.2 trillion. There's a huge takeaway here, and that is that neither of these presidents, when the economy was strong and needed less borrowing, not more, neither of them have heeded that warning. They both have engaged in borrowing when there was no economic reason to do so, and that raises real warning signs for what would happen when either of them were in office in 2025, which, as we just covered, is a huge year for fiscal policies.
The other big problem, of course, is entitlements. That's the biggest chunk of this budget and defense. When it comes to entitlements, have you heard anything from either party that they're looking at shoring this up?
I was going to say, yeah, I've heard they don't plan to fix it, which is just the biggest, frankly, pander that you could have. Both of them are trying to scare American seniors that the other party would do something to harm their benefits and reassure people that they won't do anything to fix the program by calling it protecting it. To be clear, Social Security and Medicare are both facing insolvency. If we don't make changes in roughly a decade, there will be across-the-board automatic cuts for providers and retirees. This is a terrible policy, and what we need to hear from the candidates is how they would shore up those programs, whether it's looking at retirement ages, means testing, raising revenues. They're hard choices. That's what the budget is, but that's also what leadership is. And we need to hear from them how they would fix entitlements. Beware of anyone promising not to touch the program, because that is what threatens seniors and all the people who are paying into the program.
Maya, you were the perfect guest for this conversation. Thanks for being with us. Maya McInnes there of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and a Not So Responsible Federal Budget. Maya nailed it. The fact we've been doing this with unemployment south of 4% for the best part of 2 years is pretty shocking.
Especially because we haven't been tested by a recession. That ultimately is the real question. If you can't get a fiscal response to some sort of financial downturn, what happens in terms of inflation and the Fed's ability to respond?
And how difficult next year is going to be. There's going to be a debt ceiling fight immediately come January 2025. And then, as Senator Warner's calling it, it's basically tax Armageddon next year. There is going to be a massive fight. Regardless who wins, there's going to be some level of these tax cuts continuing, but a massive fight about the corporate tax rate, SALT, and the likes.
If you get a blue wave or a red wave, the first place I'll be looking is the Treasury market, without a doubt. Coming up in the next hour of Bloomberg Surveillance, TPW's Jay Pawlowski, Henrietta Trey's of Veda Partners, Deputy Assistant to the President, Amos Hochstein, and Joanne Feeney of Advisors Capital Management. All of that and more from New York. This is Bloomberg.
October of 2019, you surprised the business world by stepping down as the CEO of SAP, a very, very large company whose value had more than doubled during your co-CEO position and CEO position. And you took a position with a much smaller, less known company, ServiceNow. Usually people, when they leave a job, they go to a bigger company. Why did you go to a smaller company?
Well, I saw the future and where it was going. First of all, I want to say I had a great run at SAP, and it was a pleasure taking them from 39 billion to 163 and really inspiring lots of people and customers, and it was a wonderful experience. But after 17 years, nearly 10 as CEO, I was ready to do something different. And when I saw ServiceNow in the marketplace, I knew what it was, and I knew what it could do. And I knew with my background, I was a pretty good cultural fit for what ServiceNow needed to scale it.
So let me ask you, what does ServiceNow really do? Tell me in simple English language that everybody can understand. What do they actually do?
40% of the CEOs say today, if I don't digitize my operations, my company will no longer be viable in less than a decade. So we were the IT backbone for companies all over the world. How do they manage their assets, run their operations, secure their operations, all things digital having to do with IT.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
It's hard to get too bearish in the markets at this time. You just have to be invested.
It's not just the Mag 7, by the way, that's high-quality growth. There are some really good high-quality growth stocks outside of tech.
The concentrated nature of market at this point is a feature, not a bug of the AI theme. The impact of AI and all of those things, we think it's positive for a lot of sectors.
What's a concern is everyone is now bullish, right? It's hard to find somebody who's not bullish. You haven't been penalized for being wrong.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
The second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance begins right now, live from New York City this morning. Good morning for our audience worldwide. It is debate time in the United States of America, in Atlanta, Georgia at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, facing off the sitting President Joe Biden and the former President Donald Trump. This promo comes to you from James Lucia of Capital Alpha. Quite a conversation an hour ago, right? Let me go through it. 3 likely outcomes, he says: a boring snooze fest, the start of a longer-term story, or a catastrophic error by one candidate that could decide the race.
My favorite part is he said it's probably 90 minutes of pure boredom waiting for someone to make a catastrophic error. That kind of sums up how a lot of people are going to feel about the next 5 months.
It's because everyone's going to be looking at the debate tonight for style, less so in substance. And it's so interesting because these are basically two incumbents. We know what they stand for, but people want to see their style. How does Trump come out? Is he going to be badgering Biden, which in the past didn't work for him on some debates? And does Biden come out looking robust, like he did at the State of the Union? Does he come out looking tired? People are concerned about his age.
We have to talk about the timing of this repeatedly. It is coming so early in the year. It is coming before the conventions even take place. And there's a reason it's coming this early. The sitting president wanted this to happen. There are concerns about his age. There are concerns about his energy. And if you look at where some of the polls are, specifically in swing states, he's not doing so well and hasn't been for a long, long time. The hope is, if you get engagement, that things start to turn and turn in his favor. That's his hope. And they want to get that engagement quite early on.
And they also want to make sure that those whispers about potentially could it not be a candidate Biden, that those whispers are put to death. And maybe they can do that this evening. But Jonathan, I'm glad you brought up the polls. Bruising polls for the sitting president from Quinnipiac yesterday, from the New York Times Siena. And what I found so interesting about the New York Times Siena poll was that the two vulnerabilities for both these individuals, for Trump, it's not really a vulnerability. That's the conviction. People are ignoring that. But for Biden, what continues to come up about the concerns of his age at 81 years old.
All I could say is a lot of people are probably listening to this and saying blah, blah, blah. And then they're going to watch the debate purely for entertainment and then go blah, blah, blah. Is there going to be something that changes? What do you do with that in the markets? People don't want to make a prediction because you can't predict who's going to win and you can't predict what the outcome in markets is going to be after such win.
Chris Barangi said it of Gabelli Funds in the last hour. It's really difficult this time around because it's unclear which one is going to be the best one for markets. And I'd go back to 2016. We all remember what happened then. A lot of people thought that President Trump would be bad for markets, and it turned out they were dead wrong.
What I find interesting about this time around is that people have been hiding out in the big tech names, in NVIDIA, in Microsoft, in order to get sort of independent of these risks that they can't control. Regardless of the outcome, do we get a rotation out of those names as more certainty in policy comes back and people don't want to be in the most crowded areas? There are a lot of interesting aspects under the market that will potentially unravel as a result to the lack of clarity that so many people have on this key event.
We'll discuss some of those names a little bit later. One name in the pre-market we can discuss is Micron. Micron's down about 5.6% in the pre-market. I'm going to say disappointing high expectations, but you know, you look at the numbers, Bramo, they weren't that bad, but we've seen this movie a few times over the last few months.
Especially in the AI space, there is a fear, and Mike Wilson of Morgan Stanley highlighted it well, that there are some companies that have gotten wrapped up in the momentum that we've seen around AI that don't deserve to be. If you don't have the numbers to back up astronomic growth similar to NVIDIA, how much do names get punished? We're finding out.
That name down 5.65% in early trading. The broader market looks a little something like this. Let's start with the S&P 500. Equities